next Battle of Ideas session is entitled, Is There a Ghost in the Machine? It's part of the Battle for Our Brains strand, which is sponsored by the Wellcome Trust, to whom we're very grateful. We now arrive at the big question, the centrepiece of the strand, namely whether and in what sense human beings have a soul or a self or a mind that's distinct from their tangible physical shell. This question has vexed thinkers for centuries. There's a reason people talk about the hard problem of consciousness, and in the next hour and a half we're going to solve it. We're going to try. The phrase we use in the title, Ghost in the Machine, it's a phrase that was used in the late 1940s by the philosopher Gilbert Ryle. It was a disparaging way of summing up the dualism of René Descartes. And here to grapple with the question of whether there is indeed a ghost in the machine, we're very fortunate to have some of the most eminent speakers in relevant disciplines. I'll introduce them to you in the order in which they're going to speak. I can't possibly do justice to their work in the limited time available, or we wouldn't even get round to having the debate. So I urge any of you who are unfamiliar with any of them to look them up. They're much more extensive biographies on the Battle of Ideas website. Right. To kick us off, on my far right, spatially, probably not politically, we have Raymond Tallis. He'll be known to many of you, a man of many talents, emeritus professor of geriatric medicine at the University of Manchester, and until recently, a consultant physician in healthcare of the elderly in Salford, an advisor to the government on the subject of healthcare for older people. But in addition to his medical work and his research publications under those auspices, he's also a prolific author of books of philosophy, anthropology, criticism, fiction, poetry. He's visiting professor of English at the University of Liverpool, and two of his most recent books, The Kingdom of Infinite Space, A Fantastical Journey Around Your Head, and this year's Aping Mankind, Neuromania, Darwinitis and the Misrepresentation of Humanity, are especially relevant to this debate. We're very pleased to have him. We're then delighted to have, on my immediate right, Richard Swinburne, who's Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. And for several decades now, Richard has been one of the world's most influential thinkers, putting forward the philosophical case for the existence of God and the existence of the soul. He too is a very prolific author. He's written many of the most important works of natural theology and Christian apologetics of our time, most notably his trilogy The Coherence of Theism, The Existence of God, and Faith and Reason. And if you'll forgive the pun, he makes no bones about the fact that he's a mind-body dualist. It's a position he defends in his book The Evolution of the Soul, and it's a position I hope he's going to defend here today. Next we have, on my immediate left, Martha Robinson, who's a researcher in neuroscience at University College London, and who's actually responsible for coming up with the original idea for this session. Martha and I had several blazing rows at last year's Battle of Ideas about the extent to which the natural sciences can account for what it is to be human. And so when she came to me proposing that she and I tackle this question head on in this debate today, I thought it was best for my health if I simply said yes. And her main interest is neural computation, how microcircuits contribute to information processing. Some of you may have already seen a very provocative piece she wrote for the website of the Independent newspaper earlier this month, which was entitled Surely By Now We've Outgrown the Soul, in which she set out her stall in no uncertain terms. Last, but by no means least, on my far left, politically and spatially probably, we have Dr Stuart Derbyshire. He's senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Birmingham. His laboratory there investigates the mechanisms behind functional pain. And broadly speaking, that means pain that can't be explained by disease or injury. So Stuart has a very practical concern with the relationship between the body and the mind, and maybe even the soul. We'll find that out in a minute. But like Martha, with her work, Stuart also has a much broader political and philosophical interest in what the basis of our humanity is. He's written and spoken widely on that question, advised government and the authorities both in the UK and in the USA, where he lived and worked for several years. And just to keep things interesting, he's also reviewed at least one of Ray's books, favourably but not uncritically. So I can't think of a better group of people to tackle a hard problem, or indeed the hard problem. They're each going to speak for no longer than 7 minutes. I'm going to keep them to time. And after that, we can open discussion up and explore the issues in greater depth. Without further ado, can you please kick us off, Ray?
Oh, thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Martha and Sandy, for having a blazing row which has delivered us to this spot. Great. And actually, the bill for this, there were the description of this session was rather a lot of questions. In fact, I felt a bit like Gertrude Stein on her deathbed when she said, what is the answer? And there was silence. She said, okay, what's the question? But it does seem to me we've narrowed it down, partly, I think, due to Richard's suggestion, to that of mind-body dualism. But this is still no small matter. And I'm reminded of the famous Monty Python contest in which you had to summarise Proust in 60 seconds on the beach. And if I tell you I've devoted a 1,000-page trilogy to this very thing, then you will appreciate that my comments will feel very sketchy to me, even though they may seem intolerably dragged out to you. Now, there are many reasons why we are, and indeed should be, tempted to espouse dualism. In other words, the idea that there are two fundamental kinds of substance in the world, mind and matter. At the common sense level, this seems to do justice to the difference between, say, pebbles and thoughts. They are clearly not simple variations on the same kind of stuff. And it seems even more justified when you think of conscious beings such as ourselves. Our thoughts on the one hand, and our body parts on the other, seem quite different kinds of things. And this difference is underlined when we do what Descartes did, and subsequently most biologists, and see living organisms such as our bodies as sets of mechanisms. If our bodies are machines, unconscious and automatic, then there must be something else to us than our bodies. This is the ghost that haunts the machine. In some sense inhabits it, though not, as Descartes himself emphasized, like a pilot in a ship. The ghost is made up of thoughts, perceptions, memories, intentions, and so on. So that's the essential case for dualism. But in acknowledging our dual nature as both an unfolding consciousness and as a piece of meat living its organic life, we create new problems for ourselves. The body is extended and located in space, whereas the mind, according to Descartes and many who followed, is neither of those things. So on earth could the body interact with the mind? How is a mind allocated to a particular body? More to the point, if the ghost is the source of our freedom, of our being more than a helpless machine acting out a biological script, the seat of those thoughts and conscious intentions that are supposed to initiate and guide free actions, how does this thing have any traction on the body? The ghost not only lacks location and occupies no space, it has none of the physical powers that would give it the clout to act on the material body, to kick-start and direct the bodily machine, and hence to act on the world. It will be even more impotent than fog trying to knock down a building. The material world, we're told, responds to real physical causes, not ghostly causes. So dualism seems at once to be necessary and indefensible. And this is one of the sources of the contemporary materialism, which says there isn't matter plus mind, there's only matter. What we think of as mind, thoughts, memories, intelligence, and so on, are simply material events in a very special bit of matter, namely the brain inside the darkness of your skull. The material events in question are, of course, nerve impulses. Now, there are dozens of reasons for rejecting this belief, and those who doubt this will doubt no more after they've worked their way through the pitilessly extended arguments that I offer in the pages of Aping Mankind, but I'm sure we'll come back to it when Martha has had her say. But one of the most straightforward arguments against the notion that the contents of consciousness are identical with nerve impulses in the brain is that nerve impulses are quite unlike experiences. And any attempt to wriggle around that problem by, for example, arguing that nerve impulses and experiences are two aspects of the same thing, or the same thing seen at two levels, are fatally flawed, because consciousness is required for there to be aspects, for there to be levels. And the fact that the overwhelming majority of nerve impulses, even those in the posher parts of the brain, such as the cerebral cortex, are not associated with even a smidgen of awareness. And this shows how being a nerve impulse is not enough. Being a nerve impulse in the right place, in the cerebral cortex, say rather the cerebellum or the spinal cord, doesn't seem a sufficient warrant to upgrade it from matter to mind. And there are innumerable aspects of consciousness, such as its unity and multiplicity of the conscious moment, which Richard has talked about extremely well, and temporal depth, the explicit presence of the past and the explicit presence of the future, that cannot be accommodated in a material object such as the brain, which is what it is. There is, in short, nothing in the brain that would make it the basis of a subject who is aware of herself, or a place where a part of the material world is revealed to another part of the material world, which then feels that it is at the centre of the world. More generally, to use a philosophical term, there are no phenomenal appearances in the material world. So, if we reject dualism and embrace materialism, which says there's only one kind of stuff, namely matter, we find ourselves in another kind of mess. So one increasingly popular way of dealing with this, attracting quite respectable contemporary philosophers such as Galen Strawson and David Chalmers, is to say the brain doesn't have to generate the mind. Mind and matter are just two aspects of a single kind of stuff that is everywhere. And it's just in the brain that the mind aspect comes together in a sufficient concentration to amount to full-blown consciousness and things like thoughts and memories. However, if you're really serious about understanding the difference between a thought and a pebble, or things that think as we do, and thoughtless things, like the contents of most of the universe, then you won't buy this idea, which is called panpsychism, by the way, and I'd be very happy to say why you shouldn't buy it. So we have a serious problem in trying to understand the nature of mind, and more broadly the place of mind in nature, and the question of its power to alter things, which is, I suspect, the concern behind today's discussion. So let me end my opening remarks by saying that the discoveries of neuroscience are entirely irrelevant to these philosophical questions, and I speak as someone who is a neuroscientist and who is a fellow of the Academy of Medical Science on the basis of my research in stroke and epilepsy, so I know that of which I speak. It is irrelevant also to the question of human freedom. We won't answer these questions so long as we start either with the assumption that we're ghosts operating on machinery, or that we are mere machines causally wired into the material world which pulls our strings, and that our sense of being selves that have free will is illusory. One final point. I am not a materialist, nor am I a dualist, or even a fuzzy one, as Martha said in The Independent, but I do plead guilty to the charge she laid against me of being eminent. Thank you.
All right.
I was going to say we'll thank our speakers when they're all done, but I think we can forego that in this session. Richard, please, your thoughts.
Thank you, Ray. I would like to take that view a little further. Scientists should start from the data. Before we start explaining things, explaining why we have thoughts and feelings, we'd better be clear about what the data are. And there are two sorts of data in this field, one of which I'll call physical events and the other I'll call mental events. And the difference between them is this. A physical event is such that anyone can find out about it just as well as anyone else. If there's a certain neuron firing in your brain, not only one neuroscientist can find it out, lots of them can, and they can find it out equally well. And the events outside our bodies are, of course, also physical events. But mental events, as I'm defining the term, is an event to which the subject has privileged access, that is to say, the person whose event it is. If I'm in pain, of course, you may well have a good idea about it by the way I behave, possibly by some inference from my brain state. But I could also watch a film of my behaviour, if I wanted to, and I could look at my brain just as well as you could, but I have a further way of learning about my mental events, viz. I experience them. And that is a very sharp distinction between the two kinds of events. And the mental events include sensations, of which pain is an example, but there's lots of others, like the patterns of colour in your visual field, tastes, and so on and so forth. It also includes your current thoughts, what's crossing your mind now, it's Sunday today, or whatever it is. It includes your beliefs. There are a lot of people in this room. It includes your desires. I wonder, I'd like to get out of this. It includes, above all, your intentions, what you're trying to do, what your purposes are. And all of these are such that, although other people can learn about them quite well from your behaviour, and maybe even better when they know a bit more about your brain, you are clearly in a privileged position. And that makes a very sharp difference. The neuroscientist, as Ray mentioned, had to say, oh, really, these are the same sorts of events. But before you say that, you need a criterion for saying two events are the same. What does it mean to say two events are the same? Is the event of my talking to you now the same event as Richard Swinburne uttering the sentence, me talking to you now on the 30th of October? well, yes, is Brutus killing Caesar the same as Brutus stabbing Caesar, etc., etc. Clearly this is something that requires a decision, if you're to say, for a criterion, if you're to say one event's the same as another or not. And the obvious criterion to use is one which, as it were, is such that it distinguishes everything different that's happening in the world, such that if you knew all the events that had happened, you'd know everything that happened in the world. Now, events are, to use the philosophical terminology, the instantiation of properties in substances at times. That's to say, an event is something that happens to someone, or some object. It involves a property, being in pain, having a belief, being square, and it involves a time. Now, if it's the same properties, the same times, and the same substances, it's the same event. But if one of these are different, then you need to know something else in order to know everything that's happening in the world. And it may be that me having a certain brain state at this time it occurs at the same time as me having a pain at this time, but this is an additional piece of information which you need to know if you wanted to know everything about the world. And therefore there's every reason for saying there are two events. Say there are one event, and you have to say they have different aspects, as Ray said, and then once again, what's an aspect? Well, it's a property, and the same problem arises again. Okay, but even if you knew all the mental properties that people have, and therefore all the mental events associated with a given body, you would still not know the history of the world, because you wouldn't know who those events are happening to. You might want to think that I am the same as my body, but that's not the case. And a number of thought experiments and other not quite so thought experiments will illustrate this to you. It could be the case that instead of me, there was a person who had just the same life history as me, was made up of just the same atoms as me, who was talking to you and uttering just the same words and had just the same future. But it might not be me. I'm not saying that this is physically or naturally possible. I'm just saying it's a different state of the world, me talking to you, from that doppelganger talking to you. And therefore a full description of what goes on in the world will have to identify who is having the pain and so on, which isn't necessarily the same as which body it's associated with. And maybe, but let's go to a little more, slightly more realistic examples of this, and let's take an experiment which the neuroscientists haven't done yet, but some of your mad colleagues may do in a few decades' time. That is to say, the experiment of the half-brain transplant. Now, there are experts here better at knowing about brains than I do, but brains consist of two hemispheres and a brainstem. Now, suppose my right hemisphere gets cancer. It really is to save my life, it has to be replaced. Fortunately, I have a clone, and my clone is willing to let me have his right hemisphere. So, the neuroscientist with advanced techniques removes the right hemisphere. Me puts that one in from my clone. Unfortunately, the cancer spreads to the left hemisphere, and so that too has to be replaced from another clone of me. Have I survived these operations or not? I've told you everything that's happened physically, and I could obviously fill in the details totally in a particular case. But what before this I would want to know is, am I going to survive the operation? Sure, there will be a functioning person who is there, but will it be me? And the answer, surely, that the neuroscientist will have to say is, well, we don't really know that answer, though I can tell you everything that happens to the brain and the body. And what could be more obvious, interesting, and important than whether I survive an operation? And yet, that's the one thing you wouldn't know if all the truths you know were simply about what mental events were associated with which bodies. And that indicates that the data, what the world's made out of, the events that happen, forget about explaining them. The data that have to be explained are, firstly, the conscious life, pains and thoughts and so on, but also who has the conscious life, which is certainly associated with the body, but it can't be the same as the body, because if you mess about with the body, you don't know what's happened to the conscious life, who it is, and therefore there's a further datum. So any true description of all that's going on in the world has got to include who there is and which conscious life is associated with them. And that is simply to describe the data. There must be an essential part of me which is not physical, and we'll give it the name the soul. You simply can't describe the data without bringing in souls.
Thank you, Richard. Martha, why is Richard wrong? Tell us. 7 minutes.
There's a lot to go on there. Firstly, actually, if you're under 4, removing half a cerebral hemisphere, you can actually survive and perform perfectly fine in cognitive tests. It's amazing. And also, brain has a cerebellum as well, which I feel like, as someone who's worked on the cerebellum, I should defend. But anyway, I'm obviously not a dualist. I'm also the only person on this panel who's not a professor. I don't believe in souls. I don't believe there's anything special, mystical, transcendent about human beings that is in some way distinguishable from our biology. And really, if I could sum up my central thesis in a soundbite style, it'd be this. We are our bodies, we're animals, we're made out of meat, and that's okay. It's more than okay, it's marvellous, it's something to celebrate. I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, the hard problem of consciousness, how do we have experiences? What is it to experience something? It's not called the hard problem incorrectly. I mean, it's very difficult to think about how we think and try and get our heads around that, and it can lead to some strange brain teasers. But I do think this idea that a thought is not a pebble, therefore we have to reject the notion of an explicable materialist universe and start being dualist seems a bit aggressive, perhaps. We don't have full answers to these questions, and definitely the activity in one neuron is very rarely to never associated with a full experience. Given that you have about 33 billion neurons in your cerebral cortex alone, and each of those is forming about 10,000 connections to other neurons, which, according to David McAlpine, is actually more than the number of stars in the universe. I think we can say it's a bit more complicated than our voltage changes in single neurons equal to experiences, and that maybe we're going to have to really change the way we think about what a thought is, and what developing an understanding of something might be, and even what the self is. I mean, these things offer genuinely challenging questions for us to answer. And what I worry about with a dualist perspective is that it's not actually really addressing these challenges, it's just retreating into something that's easier to deal with. We might have to change how we see ourselves as we learn more about ourselves. I think that's a good thing. If we don't need souls to explain how human beings work, and I don't think that we do, I don't think there's any evidence that the complexity that a human being is couldn't eventually have a biological explanation for it. We already have very good biological explanations for some things. I work in an incredibly young field. Neuroscience itself is only just over 100 years old. We've got a long way to go, but I think we can do it. I don't think there's any good hard evidence that we need anything else. And if we don't, why is it still such a popular idea among people who are so intelligent and so eminent? And I think that arguments for souls, for dualism of any kind, whether fuzzy or not, ultimately stem from a fear that explaining humanity demeans it in some way. So that being biological, being animals, being meat, is somehow beneath us. And I think that from a secular perspective, when we remove God from the equation, what you see is there's this neuroticism of humanism that's trapped in religious roots. So we don't have God to tell us we're special anymore, but we cling to the soul to fill that role. We claim that we're something clearly separate from pebbles, from animals, from everything else that exists, and that's what gives us, our reason to value ourselves, and our reason to value our interests above other things, which is, a nice, easy solution to that problem, perhaps. It means that it's not just because we think we're special that we can value ourselves. We have to look for some characteristic that's unique and that the rest of the universe might somehow recognise, that there's some extra substance to us that other things don't have. And so I think that specific arguments about neuroscientific claims, like, you can't find an experience in an fMRI image or in neural activation patterns, are kind of missing the point, because I don't think that people arguing for a soul or for dualism are really arguing because the neuroscience isn't settled or doesn't show what they want it to show. They're fundamentally opposed to the scientific study of the human mind. They don't want us to be explicable in the way that the rest of the universe is. And I really think that if dualism were real, if thought stuff was real, if thoughts and pebbles were fundamentally different things, thoughts weren't material, there was an entire universe of non-material things for us to explore, neuroscientists and probably physicists would be all over that. We would measure it, we would study it, we would poke our instruments in it, we would be horrendous little reductionists about it, and transcendentalists and soul advocates wouldn't be happy about that. Because this isn't simply an argument about whether neurons can or cannot create consciousness. It's about whether the human mind and how we think is an appropriate topic for scientific study. And the audacity to try and understand ourselves in the way we try and understand the rest of existence, and to try and put ourselves in the same framework as the rest of existence, is something to be feared. I'd also really like to explore this notion that it's demeaning to be animals, that somehow we have to raise ourselves as human beings above the beasts and the chaff of the rest of existence, or above even pebbles, because I think it's deeply problematic. Marx argued that the problem with religion, one of the problems with religion from his point of view, is that we often attribute to God the best traits of humanity, with the end result being that we alienate ourselves from the best of ourselves. And I think that's something similar is going on here with the soul, that by attributing to the soul all that's special about human beings, we alienate ourselves from our meat. We obscure from ourselves the awe-inspiring nature of what we, as meat, as physical beasts in this universe, can achieve. We're repulsed by our meatiness, by our mortality, and we attribute only our worst traits to it. And then we look to the shining beacon of the soul, or thought stuff, or some mystical element of humanity that can't be caught in an fMRI scanner and can't be found on the end of your patch clamp, as some sort of reassurance of our specialness, rather than doing the hard work of finding it within ourselves. We deny what we are, and we try to acquire specialness and value through something mystical and ethereal. And so rather than being just simply annoyed at the anti-scientific tone of a lot of these arguments, although I am, I worry about what we're doing when we deny our meat. I don't think humanism in particular will have a very strong position to argue from if it clings to these vestiges of holy light that the soul allows, rather than embracing the human for what it is, and what we've discovered that it is, what we already know about what the human is, which is thinking, feeling, creative meat. So what should we do about this? Okay, we have no soul, and probably as a result of that, no God. Is everything allowed? How do we find value, and how do we build a morality? That's the question that I'm really interested in, apart from being interested in learning about how we think, is that what do we do with this information? How do we make something intellectually honest and meaningful in the world while being thinking, feeling, loving, fighting, creative, interesting meat?
Stuart, are you repulsed by your meetings?
Indeed. So, whenever you pose the question of consciousness, there's a tendency today for it to disappear into one or two dead ends. So the first is the dead end of dualism, where the difficult questions of consciousness are resolved by a retreat into mysticism. God does it. Or the slightly more secular version, quantum indeterminacy does it. The second is the dead end of materialism, where the difficult questions of consciousness are resolved by a dismissal. Consciousness is a myth. Or, the slightly less absolute version, consciousness is a Darwinian program. Both dualism and materialism, I think, provide deeply unsatisfying answers to the many questions that are posed by consciousness. But in passing, in the current period, I think materialism is more problematic. At least the dualists recognise that we do actually have to explain thoughts and feelings and so forth, whereas materialism tends to reject these things as illusory. I think there's been a sort of a reversal of the X-Files mantra from I want to believe to I don't want to believe. Both are bad. I think the latter is just worse. Regardless, that's a bit of a side point. Faced with the dual cul-de-sac of dualism or materialism, what is it that a life scientist, a psychologist, a philosopher or whatever meant to do? My starting point is to reject the idea that consciousness is something substantive. Unlike the chair I'm sitting on, consciousness cannot be located in time or space. It's simply not the kind of thing that can be physically found and described in metrics, plotted on a graph, or summarized in a table. Straight away then you might start to see how trying to find consciousness in the brain is a bit of a doomed effort. It's not that we lack sufficient technical understanding or that we need better and faster machines to record neural activity. It is simply the wrong place to look for the kind of thing that consciousness is. There is nothing in the mechanical, electrical, or physical activity that goes on in the brain that constitutes or explains what we call ideas or thoughts. The effort to find ideas and thoughts in the brain is, as Tallis has put it, a bit like trying to find nutrition in the alphabet or sunshine in a cucumber. But what do I mean by consciousness not being substantive? Well, what I mean is that it's not a thing, but it's a process. It's something that exists within a relationship and not as a standalone entity. An easy thought experiment might help us to begin to understand what I mean. We all know that grass is food for cows because cows eat grass. But that understanding does not exactly reveal the physical foodiness of grass. There is no food, so to speak, in the grass. The foody property of grass is only revealed to us in the relationship of the cow to the grass. The relationship of cows to grass is undoubtedly connected to some state inside the cow, which is addressed by eating the grass. But the process of eating grass cannot be located within the cow or the grass separately. The entire process goes beyond the immediate physical properties of both cow and grass. And that's just cows and grass. Human beings have a relationship with the world and each other that is infused with meaning, provided by symbols, gestures, language, and so forth, that makes any machine-like account of our behavior unworkable. As infants, we do enter the world with a certain elementary mental functions, associative memory, basic forms of attention, perception, volition, and so forth. These are modular in character and fundamentally explicable within the causal framework of stimulus and response. The mature descendants of these functions, in contrast, reflect a system of organisation that is initially alien to the infant and which transforms those elementary mental functions from something fixed and passive into something transient and active. The mere association of a person with food, for example, is a logical extension of the original or natural association of a drive to eat with consumption. But the introduction of an abstract system of association, such as language, liberates memory and perception from that logical necessity. It is no longer the case that events, objects, or whatever have to be linked by a natural or a proper association. There is no proper association, for example, between the word apple and the physical entities that we consume. Apple is entirely arbitrary and negotiable, and only works as a symbol because others also use it. At least three important points follow from this seemingly simple observation of apples. The first I've alluded to. The introduction of abstract symbols liberates human beings from the constraints of elementary mental functions. Mature memory, for example, does not simply serve up associations. It is permeated and organised by reconstruction and narrative. We think through past events to make sense of them. By the same token, memory provides the constant background for thought and reasoning. Each act of thinking takes place in the context of our awareness of the past. Similarly, perception and attention are structured by concepts and categories from language and thought. The will is directed to objects that are represented as important or desirable. The perceptual field is no longer enslaved by an external flow of stimuli because abstract signs, words, now provide structure, regulation, separation, and framing. The second point I've also alluded to. The introduction of abstract symbols that organize mind means that mind is not entirely a property of each individual. Unlike the association of cows with grass, which belongs to each cow-grass interaction, the association of apple with the physical entities we consume belongs to everyone. This is what makes mind not substantive, because it arises within a social process where that process as a whole enters into or is present in the experiences of the given individuals involved in that process. The content of the objective world, as we experience it, is in large measure constituted through the relations of the social process to it, and particularly through the triadic relation of object, symbol, person that makes up meaning, which is created within that social process. Mind, consciousness, or experience as thus explained or accounted for in terms of the social processes, cannot therefore be located in the brain, because, to repeat, consciousness is functional, not substantive, and it is located in the social world rather than in the brain. It belongs to, or is characteristic of, the environment in which we find ourselves. What does take place in the brain are the physiological processes that are necessary to support a consciousness that is constituted in the social world. People with sawdust between their ears don't think or feel anything. But the fact that consciousness is constituted outside of the individual, even though it takes root in the individual, is what makes consciousness so really weird, so apparently ghost-like. That's why we feel and think like there's a ghost in the machine, because your conscious experience, in a sense, doesn't belong to you. The final point I've alluded to a bit less. Even though consciousness is not constituted by an individual, it nevertheless allows individual thoughts, feelings, and freedoms. Thoughts and feelings are possible because consciousness liberates us from the avalanche of being. Without consciousness, we would be faced with an endlessly fleeting barrage of sensations that we simply couldn't separate or isolate. Existence without consciousness, therefore, would be continuous and total, rather than discrete and discriminate. And existence without consciousness, therefore, would not be able to capture any element or object for particular experience. And so existence without consciousness would be empty, vacuous, or nothing. Existence with consciousness means that we can feel, and with feeling comes options. I can decide to eat if I'm hungry, or I can wait. I can decide to move out of the cold, put on a sweater, or stay in the cold. I can decide to shut up, or carry on talking. I'll shut up.
Can we thank Stuart? I'm going to ask the panel a few quick questions before I go out to you. I'm going to put Stuart's points to Martha in a moment. Stuart used to think the word apple was the same as the thing apple. Now he's not so sure. But that joke is copyright Ray, actually. It's the title of one of his first books. And I'm going to start with a question for you, Ray. It's a very simple question, Ray. Do human beings have souls?
I don't think they do, and I'm not a dualist. I can't say that often enough. I'm entirely, my position is entirely the one that Stuart has laid out, including locating consciousness in the community of minds rather than the intracranial darkness into which fMRI scanners peer. Stuart has expressed beautifully my position on consciousness, which of course is neither dualist nor materialist. I don't think the soul is helpful as an explanatory device. Clearly it may have some religious resonance, and I think Martha's quite wrong to suggest for a moment that my opposition to materialist is because I have, as it were, spilt religion left in my consciousness. Nor is my position based on the notion of yuck. I don't like being meat. Yuck is not an argument. Actually, what I'm arguing from is the facts and the concepts. And I think it's always a mistake to think that this idea that we are identical with our brains is a new one that's come out of neuroscience. It was first put forward by Hippocrates in 2500 BC, and he didn't have any of the neurological information we have. Final point, like Stuart, I feel the brain is a necessary but not a sufficient cause of consciousness. That is why it's worth exploring the brain to understand a little bit more about consciousness and indeed the problems that it falls victim to. That's why I spent all my time in stroke research and epilepsy research.
Right. Richard, I'm sure there's a lot you want to come back to before I even put a question to you. But I did want to focus it slightly. While I don't agree at all with Martha that we are mere meat, there is something in it I'm interested in. It was mentioned yesterday by David Jones, Catholic philosopher and head of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, in a debate on morality. And he said that there was a danger by not wanting to see ourselves as mere meat. He said there is a danger that we will come to hate our bodies, and that there have been periods of human history or periods of religious practice where that has happened and where it was a backward thing. So, is there a sense in which we need to become reconciled to our physical self? And is there something in what Martha says for that reason?
I was trying to keep the debate clear of any religious connections. My arguments for the soul have absolutely nothing to do with religion, though my religion may have something to do with my arguments for the soul.
Point taken.
Furthermore, I did feel that Martha was, as it were, trying to do a bit of psychoanalysis on me and trying to suggest why I have this mistaken view, but she didn't give any reason to suppose that it was mistaken. She didn't give actually any arguments against it. So in like manner, I hope I can give a psychoanalysis of her. The great original sin of medieval science was to ignore observations which they couldn't explain. You remember the Galileo's opponents who looked through the telescope and said, we can't see anything there, when Galileo said that he could see whatever it was, the moons of Jupiter. They said they couldn't see anything. And there are many, many examples of things which the medievals didn't see, although, for example, the Chinese, who didn't have the same scientific system, observed them. Modern neuroscience seems to be like that, quite honestly. It can explain certain things that go on in the brain, so they must really happen. It can't explain pains and thoughts and feelings and so on, so they're not really there. And that is, I mean, it is a deeply unscientific attitude, I'm afraid. And I'm sorry to press the point, but it is a deeply unscientific attitude. You should start with the data and you should describe them. And when I bring in my remarks to start with, I say I'm not going to concern with explanation. I'm going to concern with what there's there. And what there's there is that we have pains and thoughts and feelings. And what there's there is that there's a subject of them. Because if I described simply the bodies, I wouldn't be able to tell the whole story of the world, which person in a brain transplant experiment was the same as which later person, or whatever it was. I don't know, in answer to your question, which I haven't yet answered, please let's keep this out of it. Let's see what we are to start with and then see whether we like it or not. I'm well aware that there are causal relations between mind and body. I don't think any dualist wants to deny that. Of course, if you stick a needle into me, it's going to cause something in my brain which causes a pain. No dualist wishes to deny interaction. And pretty clearly, I'm tied at the moment to my body. I can't get out of it. But yes, of course, I don't see that that's any reason for thinking the worse of me. That doesn't affect the issue at all. But what does affect the issue is the unwillingness of neuroscientists to describe their data, and I think that is scandalous.
Right. Martha, just respond to the charge of scandal. And being unscientific.
Worse, far more than scandal. I want to make it clear, I do believe that pains and thoughts and feelings are real. I think that thoughts and feelings are something we can study neuroscientifically, but at the moment they're incredibly complex things and we're focusing on far more simple things. We do study pain. I mean, that's one of the things that Stuart does as far as I understand it. I mean, I don't know of any neuroscientist that denies the existence of pain or thoughts. And I think that's a strange charge to level at the science, although there are definitely charges you could level at sort of the general science as it stands. I just don't necessarily think that subjective qualia, as we experience them, necessarily lead to the need for a soul. I think there are other explanations, for example, effectively physical explanations of how these things might arise and how we might experience them, that don't call for a soul or for any dualistic view of humanity. I'm just really interested in this point that Stuart brought up about consciousness and accusing materialists of thinking consciousness is a myth and then saying you can't find it in the world, you can't plot it on a graph, it's not substantial, it has no existence in the physical world. It's sort of like, well, I mean, that does sound a bit like the bogeyman. I do think consciousness is a useful concept for our day-to-day interaction, but I think it's such a vague umbrella term that when it comes to scientific understanding of ourselves or sort of thorough intellectual understanding of ourselves, I'm not sure it's a particularly helpful term. But just very quickly, this idea of consciousness as process, I agree with. I mean, I don't think anyone here has ever had a thought in one instant, if you could really imagine that. I mean, the idea that processes through complex networks is sort of how we think and how we process information is quite a popular one in terms of the science of how we might think and react to the world around us. I don't like this idea that concepts or abstract signs or words have a non-physical existence in some way. I'm not sure where that would be. I'd quite like you to elaborate on that, maybe.
I'll let you elaborate on that, Stuart, and on whether consciousness is useful. I mean, Martha often accuses me of being a dualist by stealth. So, you know, what's to stop you saying something similar to Richard is I suppose, a related question.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to take that up, I'm not saying that words are not real things. They have physical properties, sound waves associated with them, all that kind of thing. What I'm saying is that the meaning that we attribute to a word doesn't belong to you. It's something that's been given to you by everybody else out there. And what that means is that what you are consciously aware of, in a sense, is not yours. It belongs to all of us. And that's what gives it that sort of weirdly ghostly kind of presentation to us. It's not that it is weird and ghostly, it's just that it feels like that, you know, because you don't sit there going, you know, I'm thinking about Africa, but I've actually never been there, I've no idea what Africa really is. You know, you just have your own thoughts in your own head, and off they go, and pitter-patter through they go. You don't reflect on where they've come from, how you got to them. They feel like they are clearly yours and they're a product of you. And then when you reflect on it and you realise, well, oh yeah, of course, it's not a product of me. You know, I didn't create the periodic table, and yet I know all about it. So when you step back, recognise that the contents of your consciousness and what constructs and organises your mind is coming from somewhere else that's not you, then I think you're getting closer to understanding what it is consciousness really is. And then I think you can get away from insisting that consciousness somehow belongs to your brain. It doesn't belong to your brain in that sense.
Right, thank you, Stuart. I'm going to take questions. I'm going to take them in batches before coming back to the panel. If you could, you don't have to, but if you'd like to say your name and what you do and why you're interested in this subject, you're more than welcome to. Richard has said that we should see what we are before we see whether we like it. Now, you don't have to stick to that. But if you don't stick to that, maybe try and explain why the two things can't be that easily separated. That's something you could try and do.
I really like Stuart's and Raymond's approach, but the question for all the panel really is a bit of an unrealistic scenario, to say the least. But if the baby was sort of isolated from birth and didn't have any relationships with any humans, somehow was nurtured by machines, would it develop consciousness? I personally don't think it would. It would think. But consciousness is something you develop in conjunction with society.
Yeah, I have a bit of a problem with Stuart's sort of symbolic representation of consciousness as a shared. It's just that, you know, when I reflect on my own consciousness, standing here and thinking about it, it doesn't feel like that to me. So internally, it doesn't feel like a shared thing. I'm kind of reflections of Wittgenstein here and his idea that there's only so many things you can say, and they're all bound by the language structures in which you put them, which doesn't, again, seems to negate the possibility of original thought. Just another thought side, though, when I'm thinking about this, I often think about as an IT geek, back in the day when we were first creating networks, we had a layering problem when something went wrong, of actually sharing a common language about how to describe what had gone wrong. So we sort of came up, or Bachman, a guy called Bachman, came up with a 7-layer model, with a physical layer and a transport layer and an interaction layer and so on. And I sometimes think with these discussions, when we talk about neurons and looking at pictures of neurons, we're just confusing too many layers here. I think you could do with getting amongst yourselves and coming up with your own layering diagram. And then when we're having a discussion, we can say, we're talking about consciousness. This is this layer up here. We're not talking about neurons. That's that layer down there.
My questions are for Richard. The first one is, so you gave us this thought example of if you're clone and then you get your hemispheres of your brain change. I think it's quite easy to actually answer. So if you're a materialist and you say, okay, well, if this clone has had exactly the same experiences of you, then you survive. However, it's logically impossible for them to have had exactly the same experience of you because they couldn't have been in the same place at the same time as you. Therefore, you're dead. And the second one is the assumption and sort of premise of your argument is that materialism can't account for qualia, and that therefore we have dualism. And I would like to sort of see your reasons for that.
Yeah, hello, my name's David, I'm a materialist, so I'm pleased to see that there are three...
What kind?
Well, I'm pleased to see there are three non-dualists on the panel, but I think two of our non-dualists are really materialists in denial.
Isn't that in Egypt?
Yeah. I'm surprised. I'm surprised no one's yet used the word emergence, because it seems to me for the last 150 years what we've learnt in mathematics, biology and lots of other areas is that complex effects can have simple causes. Now it seems to me the non-materialists are asserting that consciousness is a complex effect that cannot have a simple cause, and it seems to me there's no evidence for that.
I'm a paediatrician and work in the field of child development. I completely concur with what Stuart argued, although I wouldn't say that you can't represent consciousness on a graph or materially. In fact, if you think of the great works of literature or a scientific tract, they're representations of consciousness, I would say. Anyway, I thought that was a bit unfortunate. What I want to say is that where I would take a point that Stuart has made and take it perhaps a little bit further, is looking at something like child development. There are an awful lot of early thought processes which are not conscious. They are actually things that you could call hardwired or based on instinct. But the fundamental change which happens in child development is the introduction of language. And the introduction of language into child development transforms children's thinking and thought processes, and thereby allows them actually to develop, if you like, higher levels of thought. But language, of course, has come through a whole process of social development and the development of thought. And it is a useful place to start, because people are interpreting materialism, I think, far too fundamentally. Materialism isn't about things you can touch, or, things that are, are you can hold or hug or look down a microscope and see. Materialism, really, in a political way, is understanding the relationship between things, between reality. So looking at reality and trying to understand the real relationships between things. And that's what we're involved in this sort of discussion, is looking at the relationship between the emergence of thinking and new thoughts and how it then gets expressed in an individual's mind.
Question for Professor Swinburne, firstly. So this nonsense idea of a soul as a separable from the body and how it might be separable. V.S. Ramachandran reports a patient that has the corpus callosum severed, or one hemisphere disabled by a CMS. He's able then to interrogate each hemisphere and say, do you believe in God? The right hemisphere is questioned and says yes. The left hemisphere of the same person is questioned and says no. Which half of the soul goes to heaven? I've got your answer. And I just have a quick adjunct to that.
Quick.
If there is a soul, it's certainly not free. It is bound by your biology, and indeed your actions are bound by that as well. It is physical. It does not defy classical mechanics or indeed quantum mechanics. Furthermore, just look at the way in which genetics influence but not determine behavior. The idea of a free soul at the wheel is a patent nonsense. That's just what the data says.
Right. Before I go back out to the floor, I'm going to let the panel respond. You can't possibly respond to everything that's been said, so just pick what you think is most interesting. I'll begin with you, Richard, because this last question, I put a question to you that broke your rules and brought religion into it, but make of that what you will.
I must make the preliminary point about a lot of the contributions. Phrases have been used like we couldn't explain, or we couldn't account for, or you need the development of language to account for. I didn't even raise the question of how you could account for or explain. I was only concerned with what the data are. And that is my worry. My worry is that the approach of so many people is, well, if you can't explain it, it doesn't happen. Therefore, what happens must be the sort of thing I can explain. Let's just look at the data first. And the data are, and the reason for bringing in the soul is just this. It's a truth about me, and let's take your own example. It's a truth about when the corpus callosum is severed, whether there are two people who are having beliefs or one people who are having belief. one person having belief. Because, in fact, I mean, there is a disagreement among neuroscientists and philosophers about when you do cut the corpus callosum, whether there are two subjects of experience or not. I don't want to pass a verdict on that, but my point is there's a truth here, and you wouldn't know the truth simply by knowing the extent of interactions between the two hemispheres. It's a truth about whether there's one person in pain or two people in pain. That makes a difference. And it's a further fact about the world than whether or not there are certain connections between the hemispheres. And likewise, in my thought example, it's a further fact about the world whether I survive the operation or whether certain brain parts are replaced. If you wanted to know the whole history of the world, it wouldn't be enough to say these brain parts were replaced or were connected with each other. You'd have to say something else. And the something else means that since you know everything about the physical parts, it must be about a non-physical part, and that must be a datum. There is this number of subjects of experience, or this subject is the same as that. And until you've faced up to the data, there's no point in constructing a worldview.
You can reply to that, Stuart, or anything that's been said. And there was a question to you saying that this, I believe, that the sort of the sociality didn't ring true somehow, the experience of consciousness. So, respond to whatever you like.
Okay, so someone asked right at the beginning if we raised a child in isolation, what would happen? And I think it was Mark Twain who suggested that little boys should be raised in a barrel until they're 12 years old and fed through the bunghole. As appealing as that might be, I think we could all agree that what would come out of that is something quite impoverished. So I think your intuition is correct. Essentially, you'd end up with a very impoverished person, not a consciousness as we understand it. And I think that's connected perhaps to the point that, Jenny, you were trying to make. If I understand you rightly, you're suggesting that we can index consciousness with things like literature and what have you. And yes, I would accept we can do that. A consciousness isn't something that's fixed. It is functional, as I've suggested. So it will change through history, and you can find indexes of that change through history. We are transient and changeable and adaptable creatures. In this question about, well, you say it's social, but it feels like mine, I'm arguing it's both. So you have a physicality, which is you, which is separate from the rest of the world. And that physicality, which separates you from the rest of the world, protects you from becoming just a part of the mass. So what you think about, your conscious awareness, is given to you by the world that you grow up in, but then it becomes yours. And you can use it in your way. You become self-aware, self-reflective, self-conscious, and you have an ability to punt out, not very far, but you can punt out a little bit from where the rest of the world is and have some creative input into that world.
All right, thank you, Stuart. Ray.
Some quick responses. First of all, I do agree with Richard that the data are captured by neuroscience. Those neuroscientists who are unenlightened sufficiently to believe that the brain is identical with consciousness, that they ignore the data. What I don't agree with it is that the data they ignore then lead to the concept of the soul, or indeed support dualism. Someone described me as a dualist by stealth. My critical sense is such that no such daft idea could creep past me, so I'm not a dualist by stealth. I'm in beady-eyed attention. But I think there's a couple of other things which I think are very interesting coming out of the discussion. Stuart and I agree entirely that if we're looking for the nature of human consciousness, we need to look at the community of minds, and I've written buckets and buckets about it. But that leaves two interesting tensions. One is to what extent the first person who appears, in my case, to be the centre of my own world, relates to this community of mind. And secondly, how does this higher level consciousness relate to the fundamental qualia? And this is somewhere where Stuart and I actually disagree. Stuart feels that qualia, pure sensation that's not conceptualized, doesn't amount to consciousness. We've had a breakfast over this, haven't we, Stuart, I think? And that relates to whether absolute pure sensation amounts to consciousness. And that's where I disagree with him. And that reveals to me that qualia, those elements of experience, fundamental elements of experience, are for me an additional mystery, as well as how it is that we absolutely engage with a community of mind. Somebody mentioned emergence and somebody else mentioned complexity. These are two terms that make me reach for my gun, because they are always used as a kind of way of explaining how we got from pebbles to thoughts. You know, the reason that pebbles don't think and brains do, if you believe that brains think in isolation, is because brains are more complex. Complexity is in the eye of the beholder, and a pebble looked at in a certain way is infinitely complex. The other is emergence. Somebody's mentioned emergence, and I've just flogged through a 500-page book, which I'm reviewing, explaining how mind emerged from nature. And what it is if you do it gradually, it'll eventually happen. So, just like getting pregnant by degrees. It doesn't work.
Martha, do I know you well enough to assume that you're now going to defend emergence?
Well, a little bit. I mean, I'm not really sure that the idea of the evolution of consciousness can be thought of in terms of conception. I mean, it's unlikely it happened that way, and I do think that emergence gets oversold in the popular press. Definitely. I mean, if all you do when you're talking about how amazing the brain is to say, well, it's really complex and emergence happens, then you haven't made a good case. And I do appreciate that, but emergence is a real phenomenon that happens at various different levels in many different types of networks. I mean, if you've ever studied ecology and you look at the way food maps interact, I don't see many people talking about higher level sort of like ecological systems not being explicable by material science alone, and how we must have some sort of ecosystem stuff to describe them. Like, I think this is a question about the mind, not because the mind is unique in that material sense, but because we care more about the mind than we care about ecology, perhaps. Really, really quickly before you shut me up.
Only if I get to make fun of you for assuming that the ecosystem exists, and therefore that proves your point.
Okay.
Go on.
I like the idea of social interaction. I'm not some sort of crazy individualist who thinks that everyone is just blinkered and doesn't interact with any other people. I think that's incredibly important in our self-development and in the shaping of our brains. I mean, physically interacting with another human person, forming memories of what they're saying to you, hearing what they're saying to you, seeing them as they speak to you, all of those things have physical effects in your brain, which can be studied and measured. I mean, and that's how we interact socially. And I do appreciate the social nature of human thought and interaction, but I'm not sure I would go so far to elevate it to the point that Stuart and Ray seem to do, where they're almost suggesting some sort of unified consciousness that we all take part in. I think we are all individuals, but we can communicate with each other and we can have effects on each other. And that is a very important part of understanding how human beings work.
I once wrote a book that began, "He woke and remembered dying." And I thought that this sentence did make sense in the context of the book. But what strikes me, is that Raymond and Stuart really are both materialists. They're just ganging up on the poor person who says she actually is one, because they're saying they're not substance dualists. Therefore, they must be materialists. They're just saying they're a different kind of materialist from Martha, which I accept. But a lot of what Stuart said about, abstraction, language, concept formation, and so on, and the futility of looking for these things in the biochemical workings of the brain, at least at our present level of knowledge, and perhaps you would say in principle, these things seem to apply just as well to computers. Computers are linked together. What goes on in a computer is not explained by its circuitry, it's explained by the machine language and assembler language and high-level language with which it's programmed, and so on. And if that is true of computers, can we not imagine, for example, that similar interactions might emerge if, as materialists do think, it is possible in principle to build a conscious robot, or at least a robot that behaves as if it's conscious, and if you have a population of them and they interact with each other, you get an emergence of social relations, language, and a kind of consciousness, in inverted commas, that, just as you said, of human consciousness, exists in their interaction and not in their interiors.
A quick question to Martha. You mentioned in your speech, you said that if there really was this non-physical mental world out there, physicists and neuroscientists would run to go and look at it. Aren't historians and philosophers and economists and sociologists going and doing exactly that? Do you think that the social sciences have anything to tell us at all?
I had a little question that was triggered by the lady in blue, the paediatrician, and it occurred to me actually. I'm multilingual, but when I think in a language, whatever language it is. So then I wondered, well, if I didn't have a language, would I be able to think? So that's the question, basically. And the sort of case and example I want to put forward is the case of feral children who've been brought up by animals and that kind of thing, who are then brought back into society. And does that mean that they have some sort of limited ghost within their machine, or some animal ghost within their machine instead?
What strikes me from this discussion is that we're actually arguing slightly different things. The scientific definition of consciousness, the social definition of consciousness, the religious definition of consciousness, they're all slightly different things, and it doesn't mean that one is any more or less important than the other, and it doesn't mean that one or another doesn't necessarily exist or isn't something that should be discussed, but it strikes me that we're all, and I think this always happens when we talk about consciousness, because it's always everybody has a slightly different subjective definition.
This is a slightly different question than ones we've already had, but there seems to be something intrinsically different about a living body and a body that is dead. Is that something that can be explained scientifically, or is that simply my consciousness trying to deal with the situation of seeing a dead body? What do you think on that?
Rob Clouds. Actually, I've edited a few journal editions on machine consciousness, and so I did want to actually invite Ray and Stuart to say, okay, particularly from Stuart, it seems like what you were saying about the biology, which sort of precedes the abilities for the human organism to participate in consciousness, it seems like you were minimizing them to a kind of few functions of the brain or some things. Now, doesn't it seem like we could really reproduce those quite easily in silico, particularly if they're as minimal as you were pointing out? In which case, aren't you compelled to say that a robot which could pass the Turing test would be conscious?
I'm trying to work out whether, as materialists, as I think you are saying, how do you avoid becoming idealists? Because all your explanations seem to involve something that, if somebody else might say, is the soul, but Ray, you said the qualia or the qualia has some mystery content. That then inevitably leads you to something that is outside the materialist explanation. Martha said you think nature is awe-inspiring, so are you going to spend the rest of your life finding a gene for awe? So where do you go what's wrong with the soul as a sort of open-ended possibility of something beyond the individual, which at least allows you to get rid of your own faith in forcing the material into what's observable? I think, Richard, just to finish, you said you shouldn't ignore observations you can't explain, but what's wrong with ignoring explanations you can't observe?
Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to the panel briefly, same rules as before. I'm going to go across this way from left to right, beginning with you, Stuart. You've been accused of materialism by stealth again. You've been asked about emergence, and I think it's interesting because you talked about relationality and process, and you didn't use the word transcendence, but I don't think you used it. That might come into it. Emergence seems to me, at least, to be a way of trying to describe transcendence in a way that's acceptable to sort of modern scientific, tractable terms. Interesting to me for that reason. Anyway, what would you like to think about?
Yeah, I think it really matters exactly how you put all these different questions. So, you can talk about the child emerging into consciousness if you want, and that might have some, reasonable meaning to it, but I don't think it's quite in the same way as when you tip a bottle. Eventually it'll start to glug in an emergent kind of way. It's a different process. One's physical, mental. Just quickly on the question about the body, I think you can, as it happens, treat human beings as machines. So this was Descartes' sort of great breakthrough in many ways. He said, look, we can treat the human body as a machine, and when you do that, you can understand how it works and how it breaks, and huge advances came to medicine as a consequence of doing that. But also what Descartes noticed, which is what we've noticed and what we're trying to explain, is that this particular machine, this human machine, has these really odd properties. It has this ability to be aware of itself. It has language, it has reason. And that doesn't seem to be boilable down to the machine property of the organism. And that's the gap that we're trying to explain. Rob, if I understand your point, in principle, I don't object to the idea that, yes, you might be able to come up with a non-carbon-based, non-human form of consciousness. If you could work out exactly what it was, the components that you need to put it through a developmental process in a community of other creatures like itself or us, then you might create a conscious being that was not human. I'm not sure why you'd want to bother. You could just have a baby. It'd be quicker. I agree. Yeah. You might. Yeah.
All right, Martha.
I do think that the social sciences, I might not use the word consciousness, they can tell us a lot about ourselves. I do not think that the only source of human knowledge should be neuroscience, as much as I love it. What bothers me is when philosophers or social scientists actively deny what we found in science as if somehow the two can't coexist. I think there are different levels of abstraction looking at social phenomena. And while, you know, in theory, if we live in a deterministic universe, perhaps you could describe through physics everything that's ever happened. Economics might be a better place to look for an explanation of the financial crisis. You know, one does not negate the other, and I think that's quite important to stress. You know, I like novels. I think they're a good way to learn about love. But I also think maybe possibly one day, once we've really advanced neuroscience, we might have other ways of understanding love as well, and that would be good. Goes on to sort of, you know, do I want to find the gene for? I doubt it's a gene. It leads to very different discussion about how much genetics has been oversold. It's perfectly acceptable and worthwhile to try and find the physical traces of human experience within ourselves. And I don't think that that undermines that human experience. I think my sense of awe at finding, if it exists, the gene for awe would be just as awesome as any other sense. Just really quick, I really like these ideas about language. I mean, it's a fun concept to play with. Without language, can we think? I mean, that's a difficult question, and I think it's not one that we're anywhere near answering, but it's nice to think about. I mean, you know, do we have a programming language of the mind? And do we have assembly code for the mind? I think that's a lovely idea. Again, I don't think we're anywhere close to answering it, and I'll probably get in trouble with my professors if I say that maybe temporal coding or rate coding might be a good source for this. The really important part is, just because something is beyond our experimental techniques at the moment and we can't explain it at the moment, I really disagree with Richard with this idea that we scientists going around, if you can't explain it, it doesn't happen. It's the exact opposite. If you can't explain it, it's a really good thing to file away in the back of your mind for when you're writing a grant proposal and hopefully one day you're trying to get a lab. I mean, you want to find things you can't explain. That's the entire purpose of science. Find things you can't explain and then find out more about them so that you can explain them.
I'll let you respond to that, Richard, and to the audience if you like.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the lady who said that we ought to define what we're talking about, and that's why I started by defining what we were talking about. And mental events are those to which the subject has privileged access. And once you've got that definition, however much you discover about the brain, it will be a public matter. Anybody else could discover it as well as any neuroscientist. But however much they discovered, I would know a little better than they do what I'm thinking about. And that's why there's not an earthly possibility that thought and so on can be analysed in terms of what's going on in the brain. But please don't confuse that, and I did say that once or twice, with whether it could be explained by what is going on in the brain. I don't wish to deny that the way we are brought up, the language community we live in, influences the kind of thoughts we have. Of course it does. But the question is how it influences them. It influences them by influencing our brain, which leads to us having certain thoughts of thoughts rather than other thoughts of thoughts. I don't wish to deny that for a moment. Nor do I wish to deny the possibility that robots, if sufficiently sophisticated, might become conscious. But the point is their being conscious wouldn't consist in their passing the Turing test or anything like that. It would consist in extra goings-on happening into them. I don't know whether a very sophisticated machine could become conscious or not. And I don't have some considerable doubt whether when you've made a very conscious one, you would have much clue either. But it's a different question. But the point I'm trying to make is there are truths here about you which simply aren't truths about the physical. And there are truths about who is having these various experiments which are not truths about your body, because if you knew all the truths about the body, all the conceivable truths about what had happened to you, your body, you still wouldn't know whether you'd survived an operation or, and that's how it is.
I'll let you respond to that, Ray. One thing I'd like to throw in there. So Richard keeps telling us to start with the data, start with the truths. And you spoke in a session yesterday about creativity and curiosity and the relationship between, the arts and the sciences and the social sciences came up. I mean, maybe it's the case that what is a datum and what is a truth? is different in the social sciences and in the natural sciences, or in the social world and the natural world. I don't know. Might that cast some light? You've been called a Renaissance man more than once. Maybe you can tell us.
Which means I'm 450 years old, which has worried me a bit. I've been carbon dated by my GP. Yes, I mean, there are different kinds of truths, of course, and I don't think the kinds of truths we get from social science are inferior to those we get from physical science or from neuroscience. They're different truths that apply. I don't think Jane Austen was just a dim neuroscientist. I mean, there's a book recently published called Proust Was a Neuroscientist, and what it does, it patronises Proust by saying, what a clever bugger he was. He anticipated some of the things that we've now discovered in neuroscience. Talk about the massive condescension of posterity. So I think there are different kinds of truths accessible by different means. I mean, the body as a carnal machine, to me, has been one of the central insights that's created the medical science, which has made me, I hope, a useful doctor over 37-odd years. And I think that's the most important thing, that the body is a machine when seen through the eyes of biomedical science and through neuroscience. And you cannot capture conscious machine for the kind of reasons that Richard was giving. First of all, there's no what it is to be like for a machine. That's the hard problem of consciousness. There's no subjective sense of I. It's third person as regards the machine, or no person as regards the machine. There is no sense of this is me, this is I, this is the world by which I'm surrounded. It's interesting when people talk about conscious machines and invoke computers. Any computer you could buy in a shop could pass the Turing test if the person who was interrogating it was stupid enough. And it just seems to me all Turing test does is test people's stupidity and credulousness. What makes computers not conscious, that applies not only to the free computer you get with a packet of cornflakes, also to a super cray with gigabytes of RAM, is basically they are not totally open domain in the way that you and I are. Computers are always related to a set of functions. The curious thing about being conscious is you cannot reduce what it is like to be here to a set of functions, or indeed to a stream of information. Sunbathing isn't information bathing. So there is a complete difference between the kind of machine that we see in computers, and of course the neuroscience model of the brain is largely as a kind of carnal machine. It goes right back to Descartes, and that is why it doesn't capture something so central about it.
I'll stop you there, because we're into our injury time. I have been told we're allowed to extend by 15 minutes to account for the fire alarm.
One of the big problems which hasn't been addressed by anybody that Martha brought up was the fact that dualism tries to create things that are not observable. So you said that subjective experiences of consciousness are not observable by anybody except for the person experiencing them, which is a slight problem, because then you've just made the entirety of the existence of the soul unfalsifiable, which is not appreciated. So do the other people who claim to not be dualists and not materialists, is your conception of consciousness observable, and how do you observe them?
Richard, you seem to be saying that you rejected materialism because you were looking at the data and that it couldn't explain the data, and there were these things there that it couldn't talk about.
Describe, not explain, he says.
Yeah, it couldn't describe, all right. But if it can't describe, it seems to be, no offence, but it seems to be making an effort to describe and an effort to explain, whereas you've said that you can't explain sort of where the soul has come from, if I've understood correctly. You're not going to explain where it's come from, but if you can't explain what the soul is, then how can you talk about it? I mean, Martha she's not saying she has all the answers, as far as I can see. She's saying that she thinks she might, or someone might one day be able to find out.
Yes, mine is also on the soul. If you don't believe that every living creature has one, at what point in human development did it suddenly appear?
Okay.
I commend Martha for her attempt to put human consciousness on a scientific basis, but I think she's got completely the wrong end of the stick. And I think you do not need to deny the existence of the soul to realise that there's some things outside our, outside physical things that are real. And for example, I think money is a good example of it. Money is a concept. It is represented on banknotes and in coins, but they're just pieces of paper without our belief, without our understanding of them as money, and this concept is causing great hardship around the world and people to lose their very real jobs in the very real world, but it's still just a concept, and I think we should, that's worth looking at.
My question's to Richard. So you keep coming back to this definition of what it is to have consciousness, and the idea that only the individual can experience it, and it seems that all your definition does is that defines it in such a way that materialism is then impossible. And if you're going to accept that definition, you then need to do a lot of groundwork justifying this definition that you've given us.
I just wanted to say, you've described how the brain works with like neurons and linked that to emotional consciousness, but that doesn't completely discredit like the idea of a soul. Is it possible that the soul could exist as well, and just that the neurons sort of are as how it happens? Could it be the driving force of the brain functions?
I've long been puzzled by this debate because it seems to me that whichever side we take on the question of dualism, there is a fundamental mystery. If you're going to be a materialist, you have the question of accommodating mental phenomena and our sense of self and these sort of things. Although you could just deny these things exist, as a few materialists do, most are non-reductive materialists. They think that we are made of matter, that's all there is, but that the matter has peculiar properties or something of that sort. If you're a dualist, on the other hand, you have to say that there is some interaction, as Richard Swinburne indeed does, between mind and matter, and so on. How can that be? That's very odd indeed. I mean, why is the brain so complex? The brain is amazingly complex. It must be, in some sense, for some purpose. It has something to do with the generative mentality. There we have a great mystery. The question now is, which is the greater mystery, and I do not know.
One of the analogies that we've been doing, which I personally think is quite appealing, is the fact of someone being colourblind. I mean, we can see the fact that there is colour all around us, but if someone's colourblind, they can't see it. So you can use that same principle to say that maybe there is a soul, but just because you can't see it doesn't mean that you can completely say that it doesn't exist. And second is the principle of credulity, which is the idea that we use our senses to believe certain things and we say that we've experienced them. And similarly, when we experience something subjectively, why can't we say that that's not true, the fact that there is something else out there?
If in a far future we would be able to download our brains into a machine or into another body, would we be the same person, or would we have the same consciousness? The reason why I'm asking this is because it seems that not everything could possibly be explained by synapses and neurons. And I think we are a lot more than our brains, so our body and the way we interact with the world, it's extremely important. So that's the question.
All right, I'm going to let the panellists sum up in the same order to which they spoke. Save your applause, please, for the very end of the session. If you can make it very brief, closing thoughts and picking up on anything that's been said, beginning with you, Ray.
Well, the wisest question was Piers Ben's question, who summarised my opening remarks, which essentially was that you have run into trouble if you adopt a position of materialism, and you run into trouble if you adopt a position of dualism. That is why I'm neither a dualist nor a materialist, neither a dualist by stealth, nor indeed a dualist that's self-deceived, etc., etc. And I'm not a materialist either, so you might ask what I am. And you might indeed. And the question is, I think we need to go back to the drawing board. It's perfectly obvious that matter as seen through physics, which is supposed to be the last word on matter, doesn't deliver to us sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and so on. So I think we've got an interesting job to do about the nature of the basic stuff of the world. We have to start what philosophers call ontology again. And I'm an ontological agnostic in that sense. I don't know. Neither does anybody in the audience, but at least I know that I don't know. And I know there's a very interesting bit of work to be done, which won't be done if everything is arrested by the assumption that thing has been solved already by, for example, those clever neuroscientists who knew what consciousness is and so on. So what I'm saying is, it's great. All the bets are off. There's a tremendous challenge to be met for those of us who actually don't have religious beliefs.
Thank you. Richard.
Somebody said I can't explain what the soul is. The point is I've introduced this as a name for the non-physical part of myself. My grounds for supposing there is a non-physical part of myself is that there are truths about whether I survive operations, whether when a lot of brain is downloaded it's me or not me, which are other than truths about how much of the brain is downloaded. And therefore, what constitutes me must be more than this. And it's a name for that. It's a name for what constitutes my identity. That is what I've introduced the term for, and why I've introduced it. And somebody else asked for a justification of my distinction between mental and physical events. And the justification is it. Just consider a simple pain. and just reflect on the absolutely obvious fact that you know better that you're in pain than anybody else can discover from looking at the way you behave and what's going on in your brain, because you could find that out as well, and you would be one ahead of them. And since it's so obvious in that case, it doesn't need any further distinction. And as for the suggestion that the question about when consciousness evolved, I haven't got a clue. But clearly, I think dogs and cats have thoughts and feelings, and so it's earlier than that, but who knows? It's a necessary consequence of consciousness that there's a truth about whether the same subject of consciousness survives or not, and therefore if you did the half brain transplant experiment on a cat, there would be truth about which subsequent cat was the same as the original cat. So you've just got to use these terms to describe your data, and once you've done that, of course, it is rather puzzling, as many people have pointed out, to suggest how science might explain why it is that a certain stage of evolution threw up a subject of experience which wasn't physical, above all why it threw up me rather than the millions of other people it might have thrown up and didn't. That is, of course, a very deep question, and it's not going to be answered by a few more experiments on the brain, nor for 1 trillion more experiments on the brain. As Ray has pointed out, there might be a scientific project which tried to bring thoughts and feelings into the same realm as the sort of thing that physicists deal with. And, well, let's try, but they are so different and so unmeasurable and so obvious, more obvious than the physical world, that I think that program's doomed to failure. But have a go.
I think we know a little bit more than Ray Tallis does, although I do like the idea that we don't know everything about the world. That's good.
You're more self-deceived.
Perhaps. So this idea that matter doesn't deliver sensation, and came from the floor up there, that concepts don't have a physical existence, I don't actually think that that's true. I think that every idea or thought that we have has, by definition, unless there's some sort of thought stuff around, a physical existence within our brains or within our bodies. But I mean, probably the brain is the seat of thoughts and ideas. I think we've established that. What I mean by that is that, when you conceive of money, or when you're watching this operation that's been done to Richard, and you're trying to work out whether he's still alive or not, you've got this conception of Richard in your head. There's an actual physical process that's happening of you thinking about those concepts and holding those concepts, and that is the existence of that concept. These things, they're not abstract ethereal things in that sense. They have everything that we can think about by definition has a physical existence, at least as a structure and process within our own brains. And I think that's quite exciting and quite interesting. My problem with these arguments really is just that you end up with a sort of soul of the gaps. It's just the things we can't explain yet, the bits that we can't quite figure out whether you're still you after this operation or anything like that. I don't think that's enough. I think if you're going to have a soul, you have to have a really positive argument for it, because it's quite an unlikely thing. I just don't think we have that positive argument. I just very quickly like to say, after this session, I hope you will go out and thoroughly enjoy your meat by interacting with the meat of other people.
Okay, somebody at the back raised the question of language. I think it's a really important question that I completely forgot to come back to during the last round. So there's a question out there as whether or not thoughts are born in language or are thoughts destroyed in language. And if you stub your toe, you have this immediate feel of what it is like. And then when you try and articulate it, there's a certain step away from it. Is it that you experience it for what it really is, and then language doesn't help you articulate it, or do you only experience it for what it really is when you drop it into language? I think it's probably a bit of both, as it happens. Our thoughts are both born and killed by words. But the important point of this is that the word side of that is the negotiable side. So you have a physicality, which is you. Nobody's denying that there's a physicality. You need a brain of a particular kind to have the thoughts and feelings that you have. But what those thoughts and feelings are enmeshed in, the structure, the organisation they're enmeshed in, is not yours. That's something that you inherit from the rest of the world. Language being an extremely important part of it. It helps construct, organise, frame and regulate what it is you think and feel. And I would say that without that structure and regulation, thoughts and feelings would in fact be impossible. The physical side is not negotiable, but that language side is negotiable. So you are taking part in a community of minds when you think. And that's what I think makes it ghostly and weird. And just in response to what Martha's saying, I think what Martha's trying to do is describe a process, but describing a process isn't the same as explaining it.
Thank you for your questions, which were very good. You gave us a lot to chew on, and can you thank the panel, please?